Hello, today we begin learning the language of life created by God. This is one of the sentences that was formed after the successful completion of the Human Genome Project. Despite genetic science, and some would say the invention of the wheel, as the most important development witnessed by humanity, when the language of God is mentioned, all the press and the whole world would have listened and thought that you had solved the human brain and live biology. But of course, everyone was very wrong. We were not yet close. Yes, it was a first step and a very important step, but there is still a long way to go. In reality, the human genome is made up of only 4 letters, G, T, C, and A, that make up the spiral of DNA, and they come together again and again to form the basis of all living things. But when we are born, we take 3 billion letters from our mother and 3 billion letters from our father, but it's such a delicate balance that if there's a mistake in one of these billions of letters, it can lead to a serious illness. That's why the sequence of genes is so important, and that's why the Genome Project was so important. But this part only makes up part of the work, and that's why the Genome Project only solves part of the problem. For example, laboratory mice, you can raise them in the same conditions, under the same genetic code, but still, they end up being different. Some are heavier, some are more active, some are smarter. Biologists call this abstract variation. We have no idea why this is happening. The cool version here doesn't end with the black flies in the 2000s. Larvae turn into flies eventually, but when scientists look at the genetic coding of these larvae and the flies they turn into, they are identical. We don't have any coding that explains how the larvae turn into flies with wings. Furthermore, there are also strange things with crocodiles. For example, if you take 2 humans, one male and one female, even if you don't know their gender, you can tell by looking at their genetic code. But it's strange with crocodiles. If you look at the genetic code of a male and a female crocodile, you can't tell which gender they are because crocodiles' gender is determined by the temperature of where their eggs are laid. So, global warming can have some interesting consequences, like a significant shift in the crocodile population's gender, which could lead to 2 identical creatures with different appearances, characteristics, and even gender. This is the field of science that studies these strange phenomena, called beyond evolution. So, that's where we are now. Now let's start by looking at it from a different perspective. Everything that makes us who we are can be changed when we talk about fate, which is a phenomenon that appears in all religions. In addition, we are not talking about the first meaning that comes to mind when we think of fate. For example, your appearance or the talents you are born with, such as being a better athlete with all the necessary genetic codes, or a musician or a dancer. We can easily say that some people are born with this talent. When we talk about fate, we are talking about the genetic codes in our DNA. So the question is, in this case, is a person genetically predetermined to live with the abilities or disabilities inherited from their ancestors, or does the person have no control over this? Or to ask it in a more complex way, should a person have control over these characteristics or not? Let's discuss this as the world of science moves forward and genetic science takes a step forward, beyond what we know as genetics and studies that go beyond genetics. As we said before, we call this epigenetics, and recent discoveries in genetics show that there is a key in our genes, like a light switch that can be turned on and off in every situation, expressing itself in a very different way. For example, diseases like cancer or diabetes appear when certain keys in this system are closed, and when these keys are opened, the diseases disappear. This is the subject of a branch of science called rapid genetics. Thanks to these studies, we now know that there are keys for all genes, such as obesity, memory, or musical ability. And this is where our question arises. Is it possible to control these keys and genes in general? Some studies are also examining the possibility of adding DNA to sperm, which would make it possible to treat the father and give birth to designer babies. We had previously talked about this as well. Now, first let's understand what you mean by trial key. If you all are available, I can first call some studies and examples, and then discuss it. In our body, there are approximately 70 trillion cells, and each one of them contains DNA. If you try to count it like counting 1 per second, it would take about 1.5 million years. But do you know the problem here? Our immune system, with some exceptions, all of these trillions of cells are genetically the same. Each one's DNA code is the same, but how are kidney cells different from brain cells, even though they have the same code but different functions? So, here we can say that each one of us has an epigenetic phenomenon. Therefore, we need to take another look at DNA. When we say DNA, we know what it looks like, a double helix structure. But the function of each DNA is not known, at least I thought so. The human genome contains about 20,000 genes, which are DNA strands that code for proteins. But these genes make up only about 1% of the total genome. The rest is known as non-coding DNA, or junk DNA. Even though it was thought that most of this non-coding DNA was probably useless, biologists who studied the genome with the best tools available found evidence that only a small portion of non-coding DNA had any function. But this was a big mistake. In fact, what we call a gene is like a kind of user manual. It's like codes on how to create different parts of our body, organs. But there are also genes that increase our energy, or like I mentioned, music talent. These genes are part of information packages that can prevent diseases and save lives. At this point, we can say that DNA is not a template, but rather like a script. Think of it like a movie with the same script but different cast members. We call the system that activates or deactivates these genes the keys, and at this point, a major mystery arises. Identical twins, who share the same DNA, can have very different outcomes in terms of health. For example, Erica and Monica look almost identical, but as they age, Erica develops breast cancer and is still undergoing treatment while Monica is very healthy and has no signs of any illness. Studies show that the chance of both siblings getting the same type of cancer is only 1%. This similarity in genetic characteristics of two people tells us something. In fact, the so-called junk DNA, or the 98% that we think is useless, plays a role. It was previously thought that lifestyle was a major factor, but new research is showing that these keys play a very important role. For example, there are people who live to be over 100 years old and have never exercised, smoked, or drank alcohol, yet are still very healthy. However, there are also studies that show that environment can have a very strong effect on genetics. In this context, another interesting study on epigenetics shows us the power of love. In adulthood, many psychological or psychiatric disorders are often linked to a problematic childhood. The answer to this is often given in psychological terms, but this is not a definition, it's an explanation. Another study on mice showed that mice that had good relationships with their mothers after birth had much better outcomes in terms of physical and mental health than those who didn't. This shows that the environment and experiences we have can play a very important role in our genetics and overall health. When these babies grow up and become adults, they are given stress stimuli, such as a loud noise or the sight of a predator. The results are strange. Babies who receive a lot of attention from their mothers during their childhood respond to these types of stress stimuli in an incredibly calm way. On the other hand, those who do not receive love react with incredible panic, and the reason for this is primarily not psychological but rather genetic coding and epigenetic modifications, which can occur for very different reasons. For example, as how the temperature determines the gender of the egg, during the development stage, we can open and close the keys to our genetic code with the experiences we have had. But if we take it one step further, the genetic codes affected by this process are passed on to the individual's children. For example, there is a study related to this involving mice. A group of male mice is exposed to the smell of cherry blossom and then given a mild electric shock, in a classic conditioning experiment. After a while, when the mice smell cherry blossom, they panic out of fear. Then, they are allowed to reproduce, and their children are observed. The result is that their children also panic out of fear when they smell cherry blossom without any reason. This fear is inherited as trauma from the father to the child. This is an incredible finding with incredible implications and meanings. It is a finding that everyone should learn about. So, the question of whether it is upbringing over a long period of time or genetics that is the answer is both. It can explain the twins we talked about earlier. One can imagine that one of them underwent a certain genetic modification for a specific reason, or that it can explain many things by looking at yourself, the experiences you have had, and how they have affected who you are as an adult, and the possibility that a certain trauma may also appear in your child, but at the same time, it also shows that all of these things can be changed. For example, like our queen bees, who have no genetic differences from other bees. What makes them queens is that they only consume a little more and for a longer period of time, they become queens and live 20 times longer than other bees. 20 times is very interesting. There are many interesting studies going on now. We are in a big darkness, watching the expression of these DNA codes every day. But we have a long way to go. We are in an amazing field where we can have incredible effects, such as CRISPR. Feeding, being fed, and in the future, it may open the door to designing humans. The question of ethics arises here. If we find this key and determine what it is, what should we do with these keys? Where do we draw the line? I am very curious about your opinions on this matter. Let's talk about it in the comments before we finish. And I want to give a special thank you to Up Science's supporters. As previously announced by the community, I will be able to stand with your support. If you also want to be a light in the field of science and enlightenment, I am waiting for your support. And as always, see you next time. With love.